For years, the people of Europe lived under a shadow. That shadow was cast by the iron grip of Nazi Germany, which had swept across the continent with terrifying speed. But by the spring of 1944, the wind was beginning to shift. Far away, across the English Channel, a giant was stirring. The Allied forces, a massive coalition of soldiers from the United States, Great Britain, and Canada, were preparing for something unprecedented. They were planning an invasion, a desperate and daring strike to punch a hole in Hitler's fortress and begin the long, bloody work of liberating a continent. The preparations were so immense they were impossible to hide completely. Everyone knew the Allies were coming. The crucial question for the German High Command was simple: where? This was the secret that the Allied commanders protected above all others. They constructed an entire phantom army, a masterpiece of trickery that was given the code name Operation Fortitude. This fake army, supposedly led by the famous General George Patton, was pointed directly at the town of Pas-de-Calais. It was the most obvious choice for an invasion, as it was the shortest distance across the channel. The Allies fed this lie with inflatable rubber tanks that looked real from the sky, empty tents that filled entire fields, and a storm of fake radio chatter flooding the German airwaves. The success of D-Day depended on this deception. The planners knew that if the Germans correctly guessed the true landing spot, the beaches of Normandy would become a killing field. Every fake message, every carefully placed double agent, was a thread in a safety net they were trying to weave beneath the feet of the young men who would soon storm the shore. The entire plan was a gamble, balanced on a knife's edge between a brilliant lie and a catastrophic, bloody failure that could change the course of the war. As May turned to June, the Allied encampments in southern England became a powder keg of tension. Millions of soldiers were sealed inside their marshalling areas, cut off from the outside world to prevent any loose lips from sinking this monumental effort. The men who were about to lead the invasion had a decision of crushing weight on their shoulders. The Supreme Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, faced a near impossible puzzle. The invasion required a very specific set of conditions to succeed: a late rising tide, a full moon for the paratroopers, and calm seas for the landing craft. The original date was set for the 5th of June. Everything was in motion. Ships were being loaded, paratroopers were giving their gear one last check, and pilots were staring at the sky. But nature, indifferent to human plans, had other ideas. A brutal storm rolled into the channel, bringing howling winds, lashing rain, and massive waves. Eisenhower was presented with a brutal forecast that promised only a brief window of slightly calmer weather. The entire invasion fleet, the largest armada in human history, was poised to sail, but for one agonizing day, he was forced to give the order to stand down. The mental image of that moment is heavy. Thousands of men, already loaded onto cramped, swaying ships, were stuck in harbor. Seasickness spread through the boats as soldiers tried to distract themselves with poker games, sharpening knives, or writing what could be their final letters home. The weight of knowing they were about to face the concrete teeth of Hitler's Atlantic Wall was a silent companion for every man. They were just waiting for one man to look at a weather map and decide their fate, waiting for the green light that would send them into the unknown. The 24-hour delay was pure agony, but it was necessary. As the storm raged on the 5th of June, the commanders huddled in a tense meeting at Southwick House. The room was thick with cigarette smoke and anxiety. The chief meteorologist presented his updated forecast for the next day, the 6th of June. He reported a brief, narrow window of manageable weather, a temporary lull in the storm. The seas would still be rough, the cloud cover would be low, but the conditions would be just barely good enough. Eisenhower was faced with the loneliest decision of the war. He sat in silence for a long moment, weighing the disaster that would come from further delay against the disaster of launching into a storm. Finally, he looked up and gave the simple order, "Let's go." That command set off a chain reaction that no force on earth could stop. The base camps in England erupted with the roar of engines. Paratroopers, their faces darkened with camouflage paint, shuffled toward their planes, weighed down by packs that often exceeded 100 pounds. Their job was the most terrifying. They would be the first to arrive, dropping behind enemy lines in the dead of night to secure the roads and bridges leading away from the beaches. As the C-47 transport planes began to take off into the dusk, forming up like great flocks of metallic birds, the men on the ground watched them go. Then came the Armada. From every port along the southern coast of England, an impossible fleet of over 5,000 vessels began to slip their moorings and point their bows toward France. For the men on the ships, there was no turning back now. The diesel fumes, the rhythmic slap of the waves against the flat-bottomed landing craft, and the distant rumble of naval guns created a soundtrack of dread and anticipation. The might of the free world was crossing the sea, and the leading edge of that wave was about to crash directly onto 5 beaches with code names that would soon be burned into history. Long before the first landing craft ramp dropped, the battle for Normandy had already begun in the skies and in the fields of the French countryside. As midnight approached, the drone of over 1,000 aircraft could be heard, a sound that must have seemed like the end of the world to those below. These planes carried the airborne divisions, the Screaming Eagles of the 101st and the All-Americans of the 82nd. Their mission was critical, but the execution quickly turned into chaos. As they crossed the coast, the German anti-aircraft fire came up thick as a carpet, and the pilots were forced to take evasive action. In the pitch black, the tightly packed formations broke apart. Paratroopers jumped into a nightmare of fog, tracer fire, and confusion. Men who had trained for months for a precise operation found themselves completely alone in the dark, dangling from trees in flooded marshes, or scattered miles from their intended drop zones. The famous clickers, the little metal crickets they used to find each other in the dark, snapped nervously in the hedgerows. One click followed by 2 clicks was the sound of a friend, anything else meant a concealed enemy. Despite this wild scattering, the chaos actually worked in a strange way. The German defenders were utterly confused, receiving reports of American soldiers landing everywhere and nowhere. Small, improvised bands of paratroopers started fighting their way toward any objective they could find. One of the most critical fights happened at a bridge over the Caen Canal, later known forever as Pegasus Bridge. A glider-borne British force, arriving with breathtaking silence and precision, landed practically on the doorstep of the objective. They stormed the bridge, overwhelmed the stunned guards, and secured it within minutes. They were the very first to accomplish their mission on D-Day, holding the flank against the counterattacks that were sure to come. If you ask people to picture D-Day, the images that usually come to mind are from one specific place, Omaha Beach. It was here that the carefully laid plans collided head-on with brutal reality, and the entire invasion almost fell apart. The beach stretched for 4 miles, a crescent of sand ending in high bluffs. Sitting on those bluffs were hardened German veterans who had not been fooled by the deceptions. They were ready and waiting. The preliminary bombing by the Allied air forces, meant to soften the defenses, had been a tragic failure. The pilots, flying through heavy cloud cover, delayed releasing their bombs for fear of hitting the incoming landing craft. As a result, the bombs landed harmlessly far inland. When the ramps of the landing craft dropped into the surf just after 6:30 in the morning, the men of the 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stepped into a scene of absolute devastation. German machine guns, untouched by the bombing, opened up from their concrete bunkers with a sound like a ripping canvas. The crossfire was so intense that the sea itself turned red. The very first wave of soldiers was pinned down immediately. The weight of their soaking wet equipment dragged drowning men under the waves long before they could reach the dry sand. They were pinned behind tiny ridges of shingle, against the sea wall, or crouched behind the steel obstacles that were supposed to stop tanks, but now offered the only sliver of cover for a desperate soldier. For hours, the situation on Omaha was on the brink of catastrophic failure. The communication lines were dead, the commanders offshore had no idea if anyone was alive down there, and a withdrawal was being seriously considered. In the end, the invasion was saved not by grand strategy, but by small groups of men who decided they would rather die moving forward than die cowering on the beach. The famous words of a colonel that day became the rallying cry as he yelled out that there were only two kinds of people on the beach, those who were already dead and those who were going to die, so they might as well get off the beach. Slowly, painfully, with Bangalore torpedoes blasting holes in the wire and sheer, suicidal bravery, they began to climb the bluffs. While Omaha became the symbol of struggle, the story was different on the other 4 landing sites, though each had its own deadly moments. Moving eastward to the British and Canadian sectors, the men were greeted by defenses that were still terrifying, but the armored support was much more effective. On Gold and Sword beaches, the assault was spearheaded by specialized tanks, the so-called Hobart's funnies. These were bizarre, almost alien-looking machines designed to solve specific problems. There were flail tanks that beat the ground with chains to explode mines, tanks that laid down carpets of matting over the soft clay so vehicles wouldn't sink, and petard mortar tanks that launched massive, dustbin-sized explosive charges directly at concrete bunkers. On Sword Beach, the British forces fought their way off the sand with relative speed, their main objective being the city of Cannes. They were met inland, however, by the only major German armored counterattack of the day. The roar of the approaching panzer divisions was a terrifying sound, but they were met by a wall of gunfire from the destroyers sitting just offshore. The naval bombardment was so accurate and so powerful that the tanks broke formation, unable to move through the maelstrom of earth and fire. The balance of power on this day was held by the massive guns of the fleet. To the west, the Canadians stormed Juno Beach. They faced a seawall and a heavily fortified town, and their first wave suffered casualties comparable to the Americans on Omaha. Yet they pushed through with an almost unbelievable momentum. The men on the ground simply refused to be stopped, clearing German strongpoints one by one in savage, close-quarters fighting. By the end of the day, the Canadians had pushed further inland than any other Allied force on the entire invasion front. These successes on the other beaches were vital, because they drew German reinforcements away from Omaha and created enough pressure on the line to prevent the defenders from concentrating their firepower on a single point. To only look at the sand and the cliffs is to miss a huge part of how D-Day was won. The battle was three-dimensional, fought just as fiercely in the air and on the water as it was on the land. Overhead, the sky belonged almost entirely to the Allies. The Luftwaffe, the once feared German Air Force, was a shadow of its former self on the Western Front. They could only muster a handful of sorties against a swarm of nearly 11,000 Allied aircraft. The most famous of these aircraft was the P-51 Mustang and the tank-busting Typhoons, but they weren't just dropping bombs. Their biggest contribution was keeping the German reinforcements away. Any German truck, tank, or marching column that tried to move toward the beaches during daylight hours was instantly pounced upon. Pilots flew so low over the French roads that soldiers on the ground could see the pilots' faces. They were like a steel umbrella, holding back the flood of German reserves that could have thrown the invaders back into the sea. The men on the beaches, pinned down by machine gun fire, could look up and see the contrails weaving across the sky, a sign that they were not entirely alone in this hell. Then there was the Navy, The sailors manning the destroyers and the battleships perform an act of seamanship that defies belief. Seeing the infantry trapped on Omaha Beach, the commanders made a radical decision. They ordered their massive ships to move in so close to the shore that they risked running aground. With the bottoms of their hulls almost scraping the sand, they fired their massive guns point-blank at the German bunkers embedded in the cliff face. The sound was a physical shockwave. It was the Navy literally blasting a path for the Army, an incredibly risky maneuver that shattered German concrete and nerve alike, proving that a floating fortress could tip the scales of a land battle. The day was a brutal mosaic of 1,000 tiny battles. By late afternoon, the tidal wave of men and material was simply becoming too much for the German defenders to contain. The Atlantic Wall, which Hitler had boasted would repel any invasion, had been cracked wide open. The German command structure was paralyzed by confusion and a disastrous delay. The top German field marshal in charge of the Panzer Reserves was Erwin Rommel, but he was back in Germany celebrating his wife's birthday, convinced the weather was too bad for an invasion. Even worse, the reserve tank divisions could not be moved without the direct permission of Hitler himself, and the Führer was asleep. His staff refused to wake him with the news, a fatal hesitation that cost the Germans the beaches. This hesitation meant that the hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers landing behind the initial wave faced a disorganized and sluggish response. The tide of the battle began to turn permanently. The flat-bottomed Higgins boats kept coming, wave after wave, spilling out reinforcements, jeeps, artillery pieces, and crates of ammunition directly onto the sand. The noise was an industrial roar of engines, gunfire, and shouting sergeants. The beaches were no longer just a killing zone, they were transforming into a chaotic, bustling, and mud-spattered supply base. The cost of this foothold was staggeringly high and visible everywhere. Medics, their helmets marked with bright red crosses, worked frantically in the sand, often under direct fire, trying to patch up the shattered limbs and bleeding wounds of men who had just been walking and talking hours before. They did not discriminate. They treated Americans, Brits, Canadians, and even German prisoners with the same urgent care. The sight of a jeep driving past with a wounded man strapped to the hood because there was no room inside was a common one. By the time the sun began to set on the blood-soaked sand, the outcome was no longer in doubt. The Allies had not just raided the coast, they had arrived to stay, and there was no pushing them back into the sea now. As dusk fell over Normandy on the evening of June the 6th, the immediate sounds of battle began to quiet down, replaced by the groans of the wounded and the distant, sporadic crack of a sniper's rifle. The men who had survived the day were operating on pure adrenaline and exhaustion. They dug into the soft earth, carving out foxholes with their helmets if they had lost their entrenching tools, knowing the inevitable counterattacks would come in the dark. The night was cold and damp, a sharp contrast to the burning heat of the firefight just hours earlier. Soldiers huddled together, smoking cigarettes with trembling hands, the glowing embers cupped tightly to hide the light. The psychological toll of what they had just witnessed began to sink in. There was little celebration on the front lines, only a numb, bone-deep weariness. They were surrounded by the debris of war, abandoned weapons, ripped packs, and the silent, shrouded forms of those who hadn't made it. There was no marching triumphantly through French villages yet. The fight had just moved inland. The bocage country, the ancient hedgerow-lined fields of Normandy, awaited them, and it was terrain custom-built for defense. Every field was a potential death trap, a natural fortress for the German defenders who were already regrouping. Back in England, the news was beginning to filter through. Radio broadcasts were interrupted with solemn announcements. The streets of New York, London, and Toronto grew quiet as people gathered to pray and listen. In churches and factories, a collective breath was held. General Eisenhower had already written a secret, private note before the invasion, a note to be published only in the event of failure. It placed the full weight of the blame on himself. It was a burden he did not have to shoulder, because against all the odds, his boys had not failed. The note was crumpled up and forgotten, but its existence is a haunting reminder of just how close history came to writing a very different, much darker ending that day. When we look back at the 6th of June, we are really looking at a singular fulcrum on which the entire 20th century tilted. The success of D-Day did not just win a battle, it ensured the survival of the democratic idea. If the Allies had been thrown back into the sea, the war could have dragged on for another decade. It would have given Nazi Germany the breathing room to perfect its terrifying new weapons or strengthen its grip on the continent so tightly that liberation became a fantasy. The men who crawled up those beaches gave the world a future that did not belong to a totalitarian regime. The event changed warfare forever, because it was a masterclass in logistics. It proved that a massive oceanic invasion against a fortified shore was possible. It was a victory of planning, of supply chains, of the thousands of civilian factory workers who built the ships, and of the quiet geniuses who cracked the German codes. It was humanity's vast, industrial, and bloody pushback against a machine of hatred. It showed that an alliance of free nations, bickering and imperfect as they were, could unite to fight a common evil with a shared purpose. But the enduring power of D-Day is not in the maps or the grand strategy. It lives in the individual stories. It is in the terrified paratrooper dangling from a church steeple who cut himself down and fought his way through the night. It is in the ranger who scaled the sheer cliffs of Point du Hoc with a grappling hook, only to find the guns he came to destroy had been moved. It is in the medic who held a man's hand in the surf, whispering a lie that everything was going to be okay. They were ordinary people thrust into an extraordinary hell, and in their courage, they reshaped the world.